So, yeah, this presentation, we're going to talk about agricultural science. We're going to talk about textile engineering, and we're going to talk about civil engineering, basically the sciences behind food, clothing, and shelter. We're going to talk about how we made connections between those sciences to spirituality, and then we're going to talk about how we came over here through the transatlantic slave trade with those skills and the spirituality associated with those skills. All right, so yeah, let me just go on and go through. So yeah, I'm Professor Ace, African Creation Energy. My website is africancreationenergy.com. As Sister Tiffany was talking about earlier, the African Creation Energy series of books and videos are essentially a STEAM education initiative which leverages African art in the form of the various African literary art, African visual arts, and African religious and spiritual art for the purpose of motivating, inspiring, and teaching STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math to Africans and the global African diaspora. So the first thing we want to touch on, right, we want to clearly define spirituality because that's a word that has a lot of different definitions and uses. But for the purpose of this presentation, we will derive the definition of spirituality from the following sources. So spirituality involves the recognition of a feeling or sense or belief that there is something greater than self and something more to being human than just sensory experience. Modern uses of spirituality tend to refer to the deepest values and meanings by which people live. Spirituality may involve a quest for ultimate meaning, and spirituality also deals with the quality of being incorporeal or immaterial in nature. So based on those four definitions, we're saying that spirituality is one, a recognition of the incorporeal or immaterial. That means not matter. Spirituality is recognition that there is something greater than oneself. Spirituality is recognition that there is more to being human than sensory experience. And spirituality is the source from which people derive their meanings and values in life, right? So when we use the term African spirituality in this presentation, we're talking about any system that originated in Africa that facilitates the aforementioned objectives. There is nothing in the above definition that prohibits science from being a source of spirituality. However, there are other definitions and uses of the word spirituality that are outside of the domain of science. For example, references to the supernatural. So with science as African spirituality, we recognize that science does facilitate a recognition of the immaterial in the form of energy, photons, gluons, and massless particles. We recognize that science facilitates recognition that there is something greater than ourselves. In astrophysics, we recognize the Earth, the Sun, the universe, the galaxy is all greater than ourselves. Science facilitates recognition that there is more than just sensory experience. For example, the visible light spectrum we know is just one small part of the electromagnetic radiation. So there's more light, more electromagnetic radiation than we can detect with our senses. There's also an audible sound spectrum, right? And the whole purpose of creating scientific tools is because we know that our senses are limited. So scientists facilitates the recognition that there is more than just sensory experience. Science is an ongoing quest for knowledge or ultimate meaning, and science gives us the ability to create what people value in life. So based on the above points, science could be considered sacred. That is something that should be revered, venerated, and respected. And since science has its origin on the African continent in ancient Egypt or ancient Kemet, then science can be considered a form of African spirituality. And yeah, feel free to jump in and ask questions or stop me at any point. I'm going to go on to the next slide. So, with science as African spirituality, the African spirituality that is science provided us with the basic needs of food, clothing, and shelter that people value in life through the sciences of agricultural science, textile engineering, and civil engineering. So this presentation will show us how the sciences associated with these three basic needs have been closely intertwined with African spirituality from ancient Egypt to West Africa through the Ma'afa of the transatlantic slave trade and to the culture of the African Americans. So the first science that we want to talk about is agricultural science. So, go ahead, Sister Tiffany, if you got a question.
Oh, no, you continue. You good.
Okay, sounds good. So the first science we want to talk about is agricultural science. So agriculture is the science or practice of farming, including cultivation of the soil for the growing of crops and the rearing of animals to provide food, wool, and other products. Agriculture encompasses crop and livestock production, aquaculture, fisheries, and forestry for food and non-food products. Agriculture was key in the development in the rise of permanent human settlements and civilizations. Those permanent human settlements also go into the latter point of this presentation, which is architecture and civil engineering. Agriculture began independently in different parts of the globe, but the earliest evidence of agriculture on the African continent occurs in the Nile Valley around 10,000 BC during the pre-dynastic period of ancient Egypt. Plantains, millet, and sorghum were cultivated in Africa by 3000 BC. Yams were cultivated in Africa by 2500 BC, and rice was independently domesticated in West Africa and cultivated by 1000 BC. We have to recognize that there are also other sciences that go into agricultural science. For example, being able to predict the weather, being able to predict the seasons, when to sow your crops, when to harvest your crops, which goes into astronomy. Also, botany and biology are the different sciences that go into agricultural science. In terms of agricultural science and spirituality, so in ancient Egypt, we know that Asar was a netter of agriculture and vegetation, and the crook and the flail are the tools that he holds on his chest. Those are farming tools. The crook was a sickle, and the flail was used for harvesting crops. Another ancient Egyptian netter associated with agricultural science is Nippur and Nipet, which were the Neteru of grain in ancient Egypt. And the consort of Nippur was Neteru, African deity named Tayet, who was the goddess of weaving, which goes into textile engineering, as we'll talk about later. In West Africa, Oko was the Orisha of farming and harvesting. And together with Ogun, they represent the Orishas of agriculture. And then here in the Americas, cousin Zaka is the Loa of the harvest in Haitian voodoo. And he evolved during the Haitian Revolution when free slaves were able to own land. So connecting the agricultural science to the various spiritual systems that we have has been a practice from ancient Egypt to West Africa on into African Americans here in the USA. So this is the video and the point that the Sister Tiffany was referencing, that enslaved Africans arrived in America with skills in STEM. 25% of the enslaved Africans in America were skilled workers. The skills included agriculture, botany, textile engineering, metallurgy, pottery making, weaving, basket making, barrel making, wood carving, carpentry, metalworking, thread making, fabric weaving, soap making, shoe making, leather tanning, bricklaying, masonry, building, and construction. A lot of these things we kind of take for granted. Like, most people don't realize, like, before you can have fabric to make clothes, you have to have thread. Like, so our African ancestors had the knowledge to take literal fibers to create the thread, to create the cloth, to make the fabric, to make the clothes. Like, you realize how many different steps are in that process. That's a deep skill to have that many of us have lost in this present day. I also have links on here to a slavery skills database, like a database that has the different skills that our enslaved ancestors had, as well as the original video that Sister Tiffany referenced. So agricultural science was so important that it has been the focus of some of our prominent HBCUs here in America, right? North Carolina A&T, the A&T stands for Agricultural and Technical State University. Prairie View A&M, the A&M stands for Agricultural and Mechanical University. Florida A&M, Alabama A&M. So this has been part of one of the essential sciences that we've carried with us and have always held important, because it's the key to life, food. So yeah, this is referencing Sister Tiffany's video, right? The medicinal practices of enslaved people. So knowledge of the curative power of plants was a way for Africans and African Americans to survive and take care for themselves and loved ones. Plant knowledge and ritual practice around health and healing was passed down through generations. So this was another skill, another science, another knowledge that we brought with us in our mind through the transatlantic slave trade. And I have a link there to Sister Tiffany's original video. And if you're not familiar, the practice called hoodoo is where we tied in that agricultural knowledge, that botany knowledge, to our spiritual practices, traditions, and beliefs through slavery in the United States for the purpose of providing different healing remedies. So yeah, in terms of agriculture, so it was also essential when we were escaping slavery, right? So the practice of hiding seeds in the hair was mentioned in the book Black Rice, The African Origins of Rice Cultivation in the Americas by Judith Carney. It says that Maroon history claims that their ancestors introduced the rice crop from Africa, and that Africa originally came, that rice originally came from Africa, brought by female slaves who smuggled the seeds of grain in their hair during this on the slave ships, right? So this was something that they were wise enough, when they were being kidnapped in Africa, they said, let me grab these seeds and, put them in my braids so that wherever I'm going, I'll be able to grow some food where I'm going. So, that was actually a genius move. And they actually introduced the rice crop here in America. Moving on to the next science. So textile engineering, right? Textile engineering is how we get our clothes. It is the application of material sciences to convert fiber into yarn and yarn into fabric. Cotton remains the most widely used and common natural fiber, making up 90% of all natural fibers used in the textile industry. So we know that our African enslaved ancestors here in America were picking cotton, but we were also producing the textiles made from the cotton. See, they want to make you think that you was just out in the field picking cotton all day. But after all of those bales of cotton were picked, then the sisters were turning those cotton into yarn and fabric, and so it was a production. It was a production, and it was a science. So the oldest example of a sewing needle is 60,000 years old, found in South Africa. Textile history is almost as old as human civilization. Evidence exists for production of linen cloth in ancient Egypt in the Neolithic period, started around, I can't see that, 5500 BC. In West Africa, so we're familiar with kente cloth. Kente cloth refers to the Ghanaian textile made of hand-woven cloth made from strips of silk and cotton. The word kente comes from the word kenten, which means basket in the Asante dialect of the Akan language, referencing its basket-like pattern. In Ghana, the Akan ethnic group also refers to kente cloth as woven cloth. Ashanti folklore includes a story where weavers invented kente cloth by seeking to replicate the patterns of Anansi the spider. So this is going to tie into the connection between textile engineering to African spirituality. West African cultures have been weaving textiles for thousands of years. Production of kente cloth dates back to the 17th century, and the Ewe weaving goes back to the 16th century in West Africa. So in ancient Egypt, Neith was the ancient Egyptian deity of weaving in their religion. In the city of Sais, she was viewed as the first and the prime creator who created the universe and all it contains, and that she governs how it functions. Neith's symbol and part of her hieroglyph also bore the resemblance to a loom used to weave fabric. As the goddess of creation and weaving, she is said to reweave the world on her loom daily. An interior of the wall of the temple at Esna records an account of creation in which Neith brings forth first the land from the primordial waters, and as she conceived in her heart everything that came into being, including 30 deities. Having no husband, she is described as the Virgin Mother Goddess. So, in this regard, Neith is actually a demiurge, right? She's a creator deity who brought forth land from the noon in the ancient Egyptian cosmology, and she used the science of textile engineering to weave together the world. Later on in ancient Egypt, Neith was paired with Ptah Noon, the ancient Egyptian netter of artisans, craftsmen, builders, and blacksmiths. Another ancient Egyptian deity related to textile engineering is S.T.E.A.A.M. She was the netter of weaving and textiles in the ancient Egyptian religion, and her husband was Nippur, the ancient Egyptian netter over agriculture. So that's that connection between agriculture and textile engineering. All right. Going over to West Africa. So Olokun is the Orisha who rules the bottom of the ocean and all bodies of water. Olokun was skilled at weaving and dyeing all types of cloth, and Olukun's skills at weaving could only be matched by I don't know how to say this. I think it's Agemo, the chameleon servant of Olorun. Okay, so we have textile engineering connected to African spirituality in West Africa. And lastly, we have Anansi the spider. I jumped over too fast. Let me go back one. Lastly, we have Anansi the spider. Is that West African spirituality is the god of knowledge, wisdom, and craftiness. It is believed that Anansi brought the craft of weaving to the Akan people. As Anansi Kokoroku, the great spider, is seen as the great designer who weaves a web of energy that permeates throughout all of creation. Anansi, or Aunt Nancy by our enslaved African ancestors in America, was often celebrated as a symbol of slave resistance and survival because Anansi is able to turn the tables on his powerful oppressors by using his cunning and trickery, a model of behavior used by slaves to gain the upper hand within the confines of the plantation power structure. So this was another deity connected to African spirituality, connected to textile engineering that we brought with us through the transatlantic slave trade to America. Lastly, textile engineering in its role in our liberation from slavery through what's called the quilt codes, or the Underground Railroad quilt codes. So safe houses along the Underground Railroad were often indicated by hanging a quilt from a clothesline or a windowsill. These quilts were weaved to embed a kind of code, so that reading the different shapes and patterns and motifs sewn into the design, an enslaved person on the run could know the areas of danger or where to go next. So textile engineering was key in our liberation from slavery. Another example of textile engineering. So we talked about weaving, sewing, but braiding actually is a form of textile engineering, using the hair as the fiber. And there's a such thing as the hair braid code. So in the time of slavery in Colombia, hair braiding was used to relay messages. For example, to signal that they wanted to escape, women would braid a hairstyle that had thick, tight braids braided closely to the scalp and was tied into buns on the top. And another style had curved braids tightly braided to their head, and the curved braids would represent the roads that they wanted to use to escape. In the braids, they also kept gold and seeds. Again, they're putting the seeds in the hair for survival. They also kept gold and seeds in which they kept for their long journey when they were trying to escape. And while we're on the topic of escaping from slavery, just wanted to speak briefly about astronavigation. So Harriet Tubman, we all know that Harriet Tubman followed the North Star to guide escaping Africans out of slavery. But what we may not realize or may not appreciate is that being able to navigate by the stars is actually a science in and of itself, right? It's called celestial wayfinding. That was the old word, or astronavigation. This is the practice of using stars to basically navigate at night, right? And so that Big Dipper star, which contains the North Star, that was the star that Harriet Tubman was following to freedom. And they actually created a Negro spiritual based on that premise, and it was called "Follow the Drinking Gourd." So moving on to the last science that we want to discuss, which is civil engineering, which provides us with shelter, right? Civil engineering is an engineering discipline that applies the physical and scientific principles for design, construction, and maintenance of the physical and naturally built environments, including public works such as roads, bridges, canals, dams, sewer systems, pipelines, and buildings. Civil engineering has been an aspect of life since the beginning of human existence. The earliest practice of civil engineering may have started between 4000 and 2000 BC in ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley, and Mesopotamia, when humans started to abandon the nomadic existence, creating a need for construction of shelter. Civil engineering and architecture, or the term civil engineer and architect, were interchangeable until modern times. In terms of the connection between civil engineering and African spirituality, the recorded history of structural engineering starts with the ancient Egyptians. The history of structural engineering dates back to at least 2700 BC, with the step pyramid that was designed and built by Imhotep, the first architecture in history known by name. Because of his abilities in S.T.E.M, Imhotep was deified by the ancient Egyptians, along with another ancient Egyptian architect named Amenhotep, son of Hapu. So they deified this architect based on his abilities in civil engineering, again, connecting civil engineering to their spirituality. Also in ancient Egypt, Ptah was the ancient Egyptian creator god and patron of craftsmen. metal workers, and architects. Seshat was the African Egyptian goddess of architecture, building, and surveying. So again, connecting civil engineering to African spirituality. In ancient Egypt, the temples were actually representations of their spiritual system. So ancient Egyptian temples were supposed to be replicas of the universe at the moment of creation. In ancient Egyptian mythology, the universe emerged from a vast cosmic ocean of nothingness. Eventually, the creator god awoke and willed a primordial mound to emerge from out of the cosmic sea. From atop this mound, which the Egyptians called the Zep-Tepi, or first event, all things were called into existence. Egyptian temples were designed and built as replicas of the early universe, with the inner sanctuaries representing the primordial mound. As visitors moved through the outer courts, through the hypostyle hall, and into the Holy of Holies, the floor level gradually rose, with the ceilings becoming lower. It also became darker as the open roof courts gave way to a dark interior chambers with just one small light shaft to illuminate the inner chamber. This confined and shadowy atmosphere transported the visitors back to the very beginning of time. Egyptian temples were seen as sacred models of space and time. So they connected the actual construction of their temples, the civil engineering, with their spirituality. Over in West Africa, the traditional African mud huts represent cosmological concepts like the primordial mound or the cosmic egg that you hear about in Dogon mythology. Drawings and writings on the mud walls embody philosophy, ideology, and belief systems, and indigenous houses have the connotation of culture and traditional beliefs. Now, that's just the style of the individual house, but then the actual community houses or compounds for families are built in fractal patterns where the part is representative of the whole, which reflects the traditional cultural beliefs. So on the image on the bottom right, we see how the entire compound is built into a circular structure, whereas each house has its own circular structure. So that it has that fractal pattern where the part is, or the individual house is representative of the entire compound or the whole. So the part is representative of the whole. In West Africa, Odumankoma is the title for the supreme deity and Nyami of the Akan people of Ghana. Odumankoma means the one who gives the universe, and his other epithets include Obuwadi, which means creator, Boribori, which means architect, and Anasiko Kuroku, which means the great designer. So they attributed the civil engineering or architecture characteristics with the African spirituality in the form of the deity Inyami in Africa. Ogun, Ogo, or Gu is an African deity of technology, building, and metallurgy throughout Africa, and we brought him with us when we came through the Ma'afa, through the transatlantic slave trade here to America.
Hey, brother, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay, so now in your book, real quick, I know you also had the Adinkra symbol, which is the Adobe Satan.
Yes.
I think that's how you say it.
Spider web. Yep.
Yeah. Oh, is that the spider web?
I think that's the spider web.
Yeah. This one's supposed to, according to your book, says the creator acts through the creativity of humans and continue to create. Therefore, common people made it their responsibility to use their creative energies to affect nature and the universe in the best way possible for the past, present, and future.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. Yeah. So in the different symbols that I have on that African Creation Energy logo,
Mm-hmm.
each one is an Adinkra symbol associated with creativity,
Mm-hmm.
intelligence, and to just be blunt, science, technology, engineering, and math. So yeah, I think the one that you mentioned is representative of the spider web. Is that the one that looks like a star?
No, this one's like an eye symbol or something.
Ah, okay, yeah, the eye at the top. Yeah. So that one is actually the unification of man and the divine.
Yeah,
So
it's the symbol of the union of natural and human creation. The symbol incorporates the eye, the rays of the sun, the double crescent moon, and the stool. The
that's
sun,
right.
the moon, and the eyes depict the natural creation, and the stool depicts human creation.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. You can go. You continue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
All
So
right.
the African metallurgical science that we brought to America. So yeah, as we mentioned earlier, enslaved Africans brought in ancient crafts brought an ancient craft tradition of ironworking with them to the New World and became highly skilled blacksmiths on Louisiana plantations. There was actually a higher price point that 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 they paid for our enslaved ancestors who had certain skills. And they actually refer to these individuals as high value men or a high value man. So I know that's a term that gets thrown around on the internet these days, but it meant something completely different back in those times. So I just wanted to add that in there.
Okay, can you explain like what it meant at that time period about the high value man?
Sure. So a high value man was basically an enslaved African with skills, right? An enslaved African with skills basically costs more to purchase than a non-skilled enslaved African. So yeah, they make reference to enslaved Africans with skills as a high value man because he costs more. Yeah.
Interesting.
In terms of African metallurgical science and its role in escaping slavery, right? So there was what's called the blacksmith song. So using a secret code, the enslaved blacksmiths used the rhythm of their hammer on the anvil to communicate messages to travelers on the Underground Railroad. So we saw how food or agricultural science was key to escaping slavery. We saw how textile engineering was key to escaping slavery in the form of the quilt codes and in terms of like the hair braid codes. And now we see how civil engineering or metallurgical science was important to escaping slavery. In terms of architecture built by our enslaved African ancestors here in America, number one on the list is the White House. The foundations were primarily built by both enslaved and free African American laborers. Slaves were also responsible for quarrying the stone and the brick used to make the structure. As the White House Historical Association puts it, enslaved labor was used in every aspect of White House construction. Another architecture that was built by enslaved Africans here in America, the U.S. Capitol building. Between 1795 and 1801, 385 payments were made to the owners of African American slaves to help build the U.S. Capitol building. The slaves would have done the hard work like sawing logs, moving stone, as well as working at quarries to get raw materials. They were also responsible for more skilled labor like plastering, painting, and carpentry. Some more architecture built by our enslaved African ancestors here in America. George Washington's Mount Vernon Mansion in Virginia. Slaves built George Washington's homes, Mount Vernon. The house had steps and walkways made from sandstone, which was quarried by slaves. After building the houses, the slaves maintained it and worked on the plantation. And it wasn't until after Washington died that he freed some of his slaves in his will. Our enslaved African ancestors also built Thomas Jefferson's Monticello Mansion in Virginia, right? They also built James Madison's Montpelier Mansion. They went too far again. And our enslaved African ancestors were also responsible for quarrying the sandstone that was used in the building of the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. So another connection between spirituality and science, again, are what's called Negro Spirituals, right? These are the songs sang by our enslaved African ancestors while they were performing different STEM activities. So I talked about follow the drinking gourd. That's basically making reference to astronavigation, finding the North Star or the Big Dipper. Keep your hand on the plow. Hold on. That deals with agricultural science. When the sun goes down, that's another one dealing with agricultural science. Hoe in my hoe, another agricultural science. Pick a bale of cotton, that's having to do with textile engineering, and let that hammer ring, having to do with metallurgical and construction. So those are the connection, the Negro Spirituals, the connection between science and spirituality that our enslaved African ancestors made, right? So yeah, in conclusion, African people have been masters of agricultural science, textile engineering, and civil engineering, the sciences associated with food, clothing, and shelter, respectively, for thousands of years. These sciences have been sacred, That means reverenced, venerated, and respected to African people and have been intricately connected to our spiritual traditions. Enslaved Africans came to America with these skills in STEM and the spirituality associated with these skills, and it facilitated their ability to escape to freedom and build this country. All right, so that's all I really wanted to present. There's some other notes that, if we want to talk about, we can talk about, but um, yeah, that's it. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions, comments, or we can talk about other things too.
Okay, so I do have some questions. Now, I had to write some of the questions down. Let's talk about Cousin Zaka. So, can you go into that as far as explain who Cousin Zaka is and why he was so important during that time with the Haitian Revolution, or just with the Haitian people and just African people, period?
Sure. Yeah. So, cousin Zaka, he has a few different names. One is called Azaka Meda. He was a Loa or spirit or Orisha that we connected with agriculture. We know how agriculture was, well, the presentation was basically dealing with how agriculture was essential to our survival and well-being. We always made a connection between our science and spirituality. So we made a connection between cousin Zaka or Azaka Meda um, to agriculture. They actually did some research, and they think that what they were actually making reference to when they came up with the name Zaka or Zaka Meda, they were actually making reference to another name um, from West Africa called Zapata, right? And Zapata is the Orisha of he has the same function as Babaluaye, so he's like the Orisha of medicine, herbs, basically botanical knowledge, right? So that was another one that we basically we brought with us in our mind, brought with us in our memory. We passed it down orally, and then after the Haitian Revolution, when slaves were free, they created Cousin Zaka. So I think that's like the story behind Cousin Zaka. But yeah, you can find out more information about that particular Loa if you just Google Azaka Meda. I think Meda is Medeh. I had the link on the slide, so yeah, people can probably go back and look at the slide and find a link to that article.
Okay. Now you also had mentioned about Aunt Nancy. Now,
Nancy, yeah.
yes.
Yeah, so that was the slaves, our enslaved African ancestors' name for Anansi the spider. So that's just evidence that you know we came through the transatlantic slave trade, and we still kept those stories and those ideas in our mind. And I know like the game of telephone, where you'll say one thing to one person, and as it moves down the line it changes a little bit. So
Mhm.
the fact that our enslaved African ancestors here in America refer to Aunt Nancy as the weaver. It's not a far connection to connect. Okay, Aunt Nancy as the weaver and Anansi as the weaving spider. That's part of the same tradition that they just passed down through oral storytelling.
All right, and then let's go into the blacksmith songs. Now, what is so significant about the blacksmith songs, and what is one of the songs that is very common that people may know or may have heard about, but they didn't know that was part of the blacksmith songs?
Sure. So it's it's not actually a song. So what it is, so like Morse code, how you can like do like a dot or a dash or a tap, or certain tapping or repeating patterns can communicate a message. So the blacksmith song, basically, imagine you have a hammer and you have an anvil, and the blacksmith is working in his forge. And then when he wants to communicate to maybe there's some people who want to run away from slavery, or maybe there's some people who have already run away who he's trying to warn to not come here. It was a certain rhythm that he would pound out using his hammer and his anvil to communicate with those people to say, hey, now is the time to run away, or you might want to stay away from this place, because the slave catchers are out here trying to find people who escape. So that's basically what the blacksmith song is. It was basically that sound that the blacksmith would pound out on his anvil with the hammer.
All right, and then you also mentioned about Smithsonian, right? The museum in
Yes.
Washington D.C.
That's right.
And you mentioned about the Africans. So why is it important for people to know about the Africans and their vital role in Smithsonian?
Right. So the Smithsonian Institute in Washington D.C. Um, the blocks, the stones that were actually used to build that building, our enslaved African ancestors were the ones who quarried those actual stones to build the building. So while we didn't physically build the building, we quarried the stones that were used to build the building. So when you see um, that red Smithsonian building in Washington D.C., just know that yeah, it was our African ancestors' skills that helped build that building.
Okay, okay. Now I want to get back to one the going to African spirituality. Now
Hmm.
let's go back to the Ifa tradition, Yoruba. I remember I read somewhere in your book that you talk about Ogun
Hmm.
represents some form of technology. I mean, but he, also he represents thunder, but he represents something in technology. Can't you expound on Ogun?
Okay, yeah. So Ogun specifically in West Africa is the Orisha of iron. Well, I say Orisha, right? In the Yoruba tradition, he's the Orisha, but Ogun is actually revered throughout West Africa. He comes up with different names in different West African spiritual traditions. He's called Gu by the Ga people in Ghana. He's called Ogo going up to Mali, all the way out to Senegambia. So yeah, Ogun, Ogo, or Gu, those are the different names used by that blacksmith deity in West Africa. Basically, a blacksmith is responsible for working with metal, creating any metal tools, any metal objects from the raw natural resources. He's also part of he's one of the in the Yoruba tradition. He's one of the orishas associated with agriculture because he's responsible for creating the tools needed to harvest the different agricultural crops. So yeah, Ogun, and Ogun was another one that we brought with us in our mind through the transatlantic slave trade here in America. So he shows up in Haitian voodoo also as Ogum with an M. Again, that ancestral memory, just trying to pass that tradition on orally. So yeah, we recognize Ogun as basically a deity associated with building, metalworking, and technology in general, right? Basically connecting our spirituality and our science. And let me say this, right? So there are two different ways people can conceive of a deity or God, right? One way is to say, okay, well, this God controls such and so, and because this God controls this thing, then I have to pray to this God in order to make something happen. So say for example, if you said that uh, let's use Ogun because that's what we're talking about. If we say, okay, Ogun is the Orisha over iron, so in order for me to get something metal that I need, like let me think, any kind of tool, let me pray to Ogun, and then this tool is going to fall to the sky. That's not how we conceived it, right? The other way people can conceive of a God is we can respect something. We can respect the tradition so much we recognize that it's so important that we honor it and revere it, right? So what we were doing with Ogun was basically saying we recognize how important that this science, this skill of metallurgy is to our survival and well-being, that we're going to honor, we're going to revere it, and we're going to deify it, and we're going to call it Ogun, right? That doesn't mean that that we have to pray to Ogun to obtain our metal. It's that we're honoring the fact that metallurgy is essential to our survival and well-being.
And I'm glad that you brought that up because, people tends to argue that you cannot incorporate spirituality with science. You see what I'm saying? And in some cases, that might be factual that you can't incorporate spirituality with science. There's some cases that you may have to separate it. But the way you broke it down beautifully, it pretty much basically you're saying that you use the spiritual components, right, to bring about the symbolism of the natural phenomena or the object or material around you. So that way, it's your way of being able to like have an interpretation and have the understanding.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I'm just gonna build on what you're saying. So like, my thing is like, okay, let's just play the tape forward, right?
Right.
Let's assume, for all intents and purposes, that you cannot combine spirituality and science, or you cannot combine religion and science. So everybody in the world, we're gonna throw away spirituality, we're gonna throw away um, religion, right? And the only thing that is left is science. Eventually people are going to start revering and respecting science like it was spirituality. Like they're going to do it. You know what I'm saying? So, so my thing is like, I mean, it's been a tradition, that traditionally science and spirituality were connected. It's only until really recently, like in the 19th century, where people even started having the conversation to separate science and religion.
And I
And they,
see that you got it right here with under natural philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really build on this slide, but I can talk about this slide.
Yeah,
So,
you
um,
sure.
so first of all, let's talk about this whole idea that science and religion are in conflict and incompatible, right? So that is called the conflict thesis, and I put the link there. I encourage people to Google that, read that article, and learn more about the conflict thesis. So this idea that religion and science are in conflict and incompatible has long been discredited and has lost favor among the consensus of contemporary scientists and historians of science. Contemporary scientists and historians of science widely accept a complexity thesis, which thoroughly describes the entangled relationship that science has had with religious beliefs. That basically touches on what the Sister Tiffany was just saying, meaning that there are cases where you can absolutely combine science and religion, but then there are other cases where, yeah, there is some conflict and you shouldn't do it, right? But that's not a conflict. That's saying it's complex. There's sometimes you can do it, sometimes you can't do it. And that's what most contemporary scientists and historians of science say. They are for this complexity thesis, right? Even if when you go to the natural philosophers, right, where they say that they were making attempts to explain natural phenomena without making reference to Greek gods. It's true. They were trying to explain natural phenomena without making reference to Greek gods. But then when you read what they were saying, even in their explanation, when they talk about the fundamental things like air, fire, water, they ended up deifying those things, right? They ended up honoring and revering those things. So while they weren't making reference to Greek gods, they still were making a connection between their science and their spirituality, right? As I said before, like the whole discussion about separating science and religion and spirituality didn't really occur until the 19th century, around 1834. And and even in modern times, the separation still hasn't occurred because, as me and Sister Tiffany talked about the last time I was here, you have the names of different deities and gods as scientific terminology. So how has science and religion been separated, right? And then I have the quote from Albert Einstein on the right. He says that science without religion is lame, and religion without science is blind.
All right, and can you explain what that quote means so people have a better understanding?
Sure. So there's a longer article where Albert Einstein is basically talking about science and religion. So yeah, when he says science without religion is lame, he's not talking about lame like how we how we usually talk about it. Like, man, that was like a lame joke or something. He's saying, basically the religion or spiritual lame in the sense of it can't walk, or it's crippled, or it doesn't have motivation, right? So basically, he's saying that religion and spirituality serves as a motivation for science, and science is what provides vision for religion. Religion without science is blind, meaning while religion and spirituality might motivate science, um, religion and spirituality need science in order to gain knowledge. So yeah, that's basically like in a nutshell what he was getting at with that quote.
Yeah. Wow. Now, it's so funny because I know you mentioned about the Greek gods and whatnot. What people tend to not understand, right? When they try to make that argument, as opposed where you can't have spirituality and science, you have to have one or the other. Well, how do you explain the planets that was named after the Romans and Greek gods, right? There were seven planets: Pluto, Jupiter, Neptune, Mercury, Saturn, Uranus, Venus, Mars. How do you explain those planets that was named after the Greek gods or the Roman gods, Roman deities? How do you explain the days of the week that was named after the Roman deities or Greek gods? How do you explain the months that's named after the Romans and the Greek gods? I mean, that would be like the first question that comes to mind. So if that's the argument, that's the case, then wouldn't it be logical to change the names of all these different components? Wouldn't it be logical to change the name and call it something else? I mean, so my thing is, it's not fair that where these different things can be named after the Romans and the Greek deities, right, in their mythology, but we as African people or African descendant people cannot come up with our own interpretation or use our own personification to, you know, label different things so that way we can be able to have our own interpretation, our own connection. Because at the end of the day, um, I mean, well, what I'm saying is we can't. I mean, it's not fair that we can't come up with our own nomenclature. Because at the end of the day, it's still saying the same thing. It's just that we have our own nomenclature and how it's used in the Western practice. They have the nomenclature for it. You see what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they conveniently, people who say, okay, science and religion should be separated, conveniently ignore the fact that all those different deities that you name are used as scientific terminology. Like they don't even address it. They just leave it alone. Like you said, if it was a real separation, then there would have been a sit down and it was like, okay, everywhere where we're making reference to a deity or a god in science, we need to change the name because we're trying to separate science, but they haven't done that. Even like elements on the periodic table. There's an element on the periodic table named after Thor, right? It's called thorium. Parts of the body. A lot of people don't know. Hymen. Hymen is actually the name of a Greek god, right? So it's
Really?
like, oh yeah. I have a video called Modern Science Terminology from Ancient Mythology. I talk about all the like 15 different modern scientific terms that basically came from Greek philosophy, mythology, and Greek religion. So, yeah, it's yeah, science and religion have not been separated yet, right? So,
Right.
yeah,
And
it's just
then
a
when we
point of fact. Yeah,
right, and then when we look at like certain symbols, like medical symbols, like the caduceus symbol,
yeah,
or like the ambulance symbol, you know what I'm saying? Like each of these symbols, I mean, it has to come from somewhere. Like, well, what these symbols represent? Why is this symbol being used in this medical field or in the fire department? Like, why do they have those symbols? What those symbols come from, and what was the means behind those symbols? You see what I'm
yeah,
saying?
yeah.
Yeah. So now, oh, so I want to give this response to the comments. So sister put those are social construct, not scientific application though. All right, so now this is where I have to put a little bit of challenge there. Um, so where you think the scientific application get its inspiration from? Because let's think about it. Those who were into spirituality, right? They was one of the first, and animism at that. They was one of the first to deal with the concept of healing and dealing with medication and things of that nature before there was hospitals and there was ambulance and all of that. So I mean, we gotta think about how did scientific application come into existence. Like, where did the idea come from? Where did the inspiration come from? Like, I mean, that's just something to think about. That's all I'm just asking. But go ahead, brother.
Yeah, no, I wish I could, because you can. There's so many different ways to read in to what somebody is saying. So I wasn't 100% sure of what she was getting at. She said those are not.
Also, she was getting at when we was talking about the names like that. I mean, the different things that name after deities like the Greek and Roman gods when we was talking about that earlier and stuff like that. And so, and she was putting that comment down while we was having that conversation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
So
okay, so a scientific application named after a Greek god. So there's such a thing as a hermetic seal, right? A hermetic seal is a description of something that occurs in chemistry, where basically you're sealing the glass airtight. Hermes, again, is the name of a Greek deity. And yeah, he was also associated with medicine. So, that's a scientific I think, but I guess her argument is that the name is just a social construct, but the scientific applications are named after a social construct, which is named after a Greek deity. And if science and religion are supposed to be separate, then they should make an effort to remove the name of deities from science. That's my opinion. Maybe there's a perspective that people may have that says that science and religion can coexist with the name of deities in science.
Oh, but let me ask you one more question, because some may be curious. Because there's some people that have read your book and they don't understand why you formatted your book the way you did. Can't you explain the reason why you formatted your book the way that you did, as far as like how you wrote it and like the pictures that you use? Can you explain the reasons behind it?
Sure. So no problem. So, as I began the presentation, tried to give a brief explanation of the African Creation Energy series of books and videos. So I describe it as a STEAM education initiative. STEAM means science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. Specifically, the African Creation Energy books leverages African art in the form of African literary art. That includes mythology, folklore, parables, African visual arts, and African religious and spiritual art for the purpose of motivating and inspiring and teaching science, technology, engineering, and math to Africans in the global African diaspora. So I think if people have an issue with the use of art to teach STEM, they have an issue with STEAM. And that is a larger argument that they should have, not just with me, but with anybody teaching STEAM, honestly. But yeah, that's the reason why.
Right, because don't nobody criticize when what's his name? It's a scientist's name, but maybe I'm gonna mispronounce his name, so you correct me. Nobody criticized when you see the Schrodinger cat, right?
Oh, Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Schrodinger cat. Nobody
Yeah.
criticized that. I mean, that's used very often.
It's they even have conversations about the science in Marvel movies, right?
There is a lot of science in Marvel.
Yeah,
I'm a fan of Marvel and DC.
yeah.
Okay,
I mean,
I just ain't
but
been
you,
keeping up.
yeah, you have legitimate scientists who can make connections and parallels between scientific concepts to Marvel movies, but there's no criticism of it. But then
Facts, facts.
when you make the connection to African art, now there's an argument. It's like, okay, now I see that there's a double standard here, so I don't understand
And
it.
not to
But
mention this, I don't know if you're a fan of anime, but there's a science in anime as well.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's what STEAM is. STEAM is using art to teach science, technology, engineering, and math.
Period. Period. Okay, I had to put that out there. But well, all right then, brother. You take it easy. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a productive day.
Thank you for having me back on. Have a great day too.
Okay, then peace.
All right, peace.
All right, peace. All right, y'all. Thank you guys for tuning in, watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I see that y'all really enjoyed the presentation. I see the people over here commenting, especially Sister Juju. Shout out to Sister Juju. I thank you for coming on here. Let me see who else came through. Let me see who else.